Hello and welcome to another edition of Minnesota Legislative Report. I'm your host, WDSE News and Public Affairs producer Greg Grell. Well, things are starting to get serious with less than a month to go before the end of the legislative session. Both the House and Senate met yesterday in a rare Saturday session. This is your opportunity right now to call in with questions to the lawmakers that represent you. We have two phone numbers. Locally, dial 788-2844. Or if you're calling from outside the Duluth area, use our toll-free number, which is 1-877-307-8762. When you call, a volunteer will write down your question and bring it to me here in the studio. You can also send your question in an email to askmlr@wdse.org. The phone numbers and email address will be up for most of the program, and we'll get to as many of those questions as time will allow today. Today's program will be a half an hour long. And now let's introduce the legislators who are here in the WDSE studio, starting with Representative Mary Murphy, who is a Democrat from Hermantown. Representative Murphy, welcome back.
Thank you very much.
And Senator Roger Reinert is here, joining us for the first time in this session. Senator Reinert, a Democrat from Duluth. Welcome back, Senator Reinert.
Thanks, Greg.
Now, since you're here for the first time this year, there's been a lot of talk so far this session about the budget and a lot of different ideas for the budget. We did get some good budget news recently, though, and that is that the deficit is shrinking a little bit.
Right. You know, and that's, I mean, it is good news. The deficit was cut almost in half by growth in the economy, and that came out of the February forecast. And I don't know what Representative Murphy's feedback has been on this, but I'm surprised at how quickly people have skipped over the fact that there's still almost a $700 million deficit and gone right to, new spending in all sorts of areas that they'd like to see. The fact remains that our number one priority, and by statute, we must fill this almost $700 million deficit. We then still have a remaining K-12 shift. Put those two together, and you're at about $1.2 billion, which is pretty real money, before you spend a new dollar on anything. So I think that the good news in February was almost a little too good in that it's allowed people to sort of forget, I think, a couple of those pretty major IOUs that we must deal with first.
So you talked about the statutory requirement to balance the budget. So what approach is the Senate taking right now to make that happen? Are there tax increases, cuts? How are you doing that?
Well, both the House and the Senate took a new revenue. I mean, what we would consider a balanced approach, and I think what all of us have argued for several sessions now. So one is new revenue, but one is also a decrease in spending, and particularly in the Health and Human Services area, which is the number one and fastest growing area of the budget, and that has been difficult, and we've all heard a lot from everyone from personal care attendants to nursing homes, the programs that Health and Human Services supports. But, I mean, there really is no way to get around trying to find a structural balance to the budget without trying to have some control within that area. And it's the fastest growing and the single largest area in the general fund. The House's tax bill is out. In the Senate, our tax bill will be coming out this week. So, there will be a few different new revenue components in it, but until it's rolled out on Wednesday, I really can't speak to it in detail yet.
One of your priorities as a member of the tax committee has been kind of a reworking of the state's tax structure.
Right.
And you had a release this week, your capital update, which maybe you want to tell members or viewers first, if they want to get your update, how would they do that?
All they need to do is drop me an email. I always smile a little bit. People think that we have multiple staff and there's all sorts of layers between them and us. We're answering our own email. And so just send me a note. It's SEN for Senate, sen.roger.reinert@senate.mn. And if that seems like a lot, just Google. You'll find out way more information than you want by just Googling me. So,
right.
But I put out an e-update every week. And yeah, you alluded, Greg, one of my top priorities has been and continues to be this issue of tax expenditures, or what folks at home would call tax deductions. We have almost 300 of them in Minnesota tax code. And what's concerning is three things. Number one, we don't know if they actually incent the behavior someone thought they would when they were written into tax code. In most cases, we have no idea how much they cost in terms of lost revenue. And what's really important there is if I get a break, it means you and others who don't get that break are paying more. Somehow it has to even out in the end. And then thirdly, they're on autopilot. They're never revisited, they're never sunsetted, they're never taken out. So some of these have been there for decades, and in a time of limited resources, when we're trying to find structural balance, we must look at those, and and probably some of them are lower priorities and should go away.
So that's bill is called the Tax Expenditure Review Act.
Right.
Is that moving forward? Do you think it has a likelihood of passage?
I do expect that it's going to be, that components of it will be included in the Senate's omnibus tax bill. And I know that in the House, Chair Ann Lincheski taught me about these, so I know that there's something she cares about as well, and I think we will have. I would like to have seen us done a review and an automatic sunset unless the legislature proactively chose to renew them. But as folks at home can imagine, there are interest groups around every single one of these, and those interest groups are very effective in making their case. So instead, what I expect will happen is we will have a review, and they will continue unless the legislature chooses to sunset or eliminate them.
All right, and remember, you are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. Get those questions in right now for our lawmakers. And Representative Murphy will bring you into the conversation. Now, you had a big day Friday on the State Government Finance Veterans Affairs Committee bill that was passed, I believe, on the House floor that you were involved in. Or am I off base?
It was Saturday.
Saturday. Okay, I was thinking it was Friday. Okay, I'm off a day.
It was the main work that we did yesterday, and it took till about 4:45 when we finished.
Tell us about the bill and what's in
Well,
it.
the bill pays for state government agencies and 30 accounts or agencies within state government, but primarily the big ones, revenue and budget management. It provides for the workings of state government, and we hope that the constitutional officers are also covered, and the legislature, and the small agencies, most of which are staying at baseline appropriations. But we also have military affairs, and there's about $9 million new dollars in military and veterans affairs.
So is that
to meet
for like
some of the
vet
needs.
clinics and things like that?
More smaller parts, but the veterans that are returning home, crisis intervention training, kinds of expenditures, and to make the families stronger because they have contributed so much, and military affairs, which is the current Guards people, and the people on that could go to active duty and are on active duty, and their families are funded through the state government finance bill. And it passed yesterday, but primarily on a Democratic-Republican vote.
And Senator Reinert, does that legislation come forward on the Senate side?
We actually had our state our veterans bill on Thursday of this past week, and many of the same components. I don't think there are big differences between the House and Senate bills there. We'll also see, and I'm not as familiar with the House's tax bill, but I know in the Senate tax bill we'll also see some provisions there, especially targeted at veterans. One of the things that we have now is an entire new generation of veterans because of the deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're young veterans. They're folks in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Many of them Guard and Reserve members with civilian careers and things like that. So some of the things you'll see are some additional work income credits for active duty service, potentially some retirement wage credits. Minnesota hasn't historically been terribly friendly to retiring veterans, and we're going to try and make some accommodations for that.
All right, another action that is being touted as a first in 10 years was the Senate passing a higher education omnibus bill this week, Senator Reinert. First increase for higher ed in 10 years.
Right.
What's in that bill for our area and also just in general?
Sure. Well, I mean, there aren't any specific. It's not a bill that has, Project A at the UMD campus. There's increased funding for both the University of Minnesota and the MNSCU system, tied to flat tuition increases, specifically to the University of Minnesota. And frankly, that's arisen out of some of the concerns folks have had about high administrative costs across the university system. So putting some pressure back on the system to try and hold down tuition based on their administrative costs. One of the things that is new, first time ever in the Senate's higher ed bill, was some state grant eligibility for part-time students. And as a teacher at Lake Superior College who has a lot of part-time students who would go full-time if they could, but they're often single parents, they're working a couple part-time jobs, it's just not feasible. We're putting some, if the Senate provision were to move forward, and I think it's important for folks to understand, the House does its version of bills, the Senate does its version of bills, we all get together and try and find a happy place with those, and so, there's some provisions stay and some provisions don't, so we don't know at the end if all of these things will be in there. But this would be the first time in the state's history that the Minnesota State Grant, which is the primary way low and middle income students can afford college, would apply to some part-time students, at least in the MNSCU system.
And what did that vote look like on the Senate floor? Was there some bipartisan support? Was it strictly party line?
Nope, there was some bipartisan support. Senator Jeremy Miller, who's been my co-chair of the Purple Caucus Initiative, was the lead Republican on the Higher Ed Committee. He comes from Winona, has Winona State in his district, and he and Senator Bonoff worked very well throughout the whole process, and I think it showed in a very solid vote at the end.
We'll talk a little Purple Caucus later in the show because I want to bring that up, but we do have a call from Levon in Saginaw, and Levon has a question. With the latest redistricting, who is representing me? And Representative Murphy, do you represent Saginaw at this point?
No, I don't.
And how would Levon find that out? There has been redistricting. Everybody's districts have changed a bit. Sure. The Duluth district's probably changed the least. But in the House, quite a bit of change in the districts.
Well, Representative Murphy's district changed substantially, but
substantially.
You're right. In the city, they didn't change hardly at all.
Mm-hmm. So if somebody wanted to know who represents them now, what's the best way?
The really easy way, and it's the way that I have my students do it in my state and local government class, is go to, was it Levon?
Levon from Saginaw.
Levon, right. Go to the Secretary of State's website, so just Google, all you have to do is actually go MNSOS, Secretary of State, and you can go to the election finder, and you just put in your address, and it will tell you who your elected officials are, House, Senate, County Commissioner, et cetera, and it will also give you a district map. So you can see, what does my new district look like, which of my neighbors are in and which of them are out. But
it's either Carly Moline,
Representative Moline,
who was the representative, or else it's Jason Metza.
Who replaced Representative Rukavina in this last election.
Correct. Thomasoni is the senator.
Right.
And Levon's second part of her question is, why do the district boundaries change so much, and why aren't the new district boundaries more publicized?
Well, the new district lines were publicized a whole lot, and they were in the paper, and most of us in our campaign literature had it in, had our new districts in when we were running for re-election. But if people aren't paying attention, or it wasn't the right day that it was published on, then it goes away. They are changed because the federal Constitution, as well as the state, always has a census every 10 years. And with the census, you have to redistrict so that there's one vote, one person kind of population. We used to have 32,000, 33,000 people in a House district. Now there are 39,500, or in my case, 39,800. And in some people's cases, 39,100. There's a variance that can be there, but all districts have to be pretty much the same size. Senators are double.
So you represent about 40,000 people, and the senator represents about 80,000 people.
Right.
That's correct. And the lines change based on population shifts. Now, it happened that Bill Hilty's district and my district were the only two districts in all of the area north of Chisago County that grew, that had growth. And so we started out with about 43, the district, the area that we used to represent, my area had about 43,000 people.
So an increase of about 4,000 or 5,000 since the previous.
And Bill Hilty had the same, and Bill Hilty, Tony Laurie had the same situation. And so those districts changed. And when the House and the Senate didn't come to a resolution on our a plan, our plans were submitted to the court, and the court toured the state, took advice from the people, and implemented the advice with the maps that we submitted, the maps that the Republicans submitted, the maps that any citizens committed, and came up with a new map plan. And the districts were changed. Fortunately, all of northeastern Minnesota legislators had a district. In two situations, they were paired. A Republican was incumbent Republican was paired with an incumbent Democrat. And then there were two open seats, which Michael Sundin won in my old district, and Joe Radinovich won further west in Aiken County and further west. And so that's how the changes have taken place. And now, instead of representing part of Carleton County, I now represent part of Lake County and the area all the way from Hermantown, Proctor, surrounding Duluth, including Precinct 23 and 23 and 11 in Duluth.
And basically that is done to ensure equal representation, because that population does shift and change and grow, or in some cases decrease in other areas.
Just to highlight what Mary was saying, in the southwestern suburbs, a district that Representative Mike Beard represents, at the end of, before the district census and redistricting, his district, which should have had roughly 37,000 people, had nearly 70,000 people. So, almost double what it should have. So it's a necessary thing to do every 10 years. And if I recall, there was actually, the judges came to Hermantown and had a public meeting at one point for part of the northeastern Minnesota conversations.
And while she was listening to our answer, Levon did call back and follow up saying that she doesn't have a computer, but our crack staff got the 800 number for us.
Excellent.
There is an 800 number you can call, Levon, to get that information. House Public Information, and the number is 800-657-3550. 800-657-3550, and they can tell you if it is Representative Moline or some other representative. Or Representative Metza that represents you. All right, let's move on here, because we do have some more calls from viewers. Gary in Barnum is wondering if the legislature is taking any action concerning the serious methadone problem on in the Duluth and Carleton County area. Senator Reinert?
Actually, the legislature itself, not at this point, and that's a good thing. In many cases, legislation's the last resort. You want to try and work things out, and if you can't, then you get to passing a law. Or working on it through that way. And partly that is just sort of the nature of legislating, but partly, Minnesota legislators are part-time. We all have other jobs or other lives. We're not experts in any of these policy areas, so something as serious as that, you want people who are smart about it to handle. But largely because of the attention that methadone got in the Duluth area in northeastern Minnesota, Commissioner Jessen with Health and Human Services has really dove down into it. The clinics here are getting a very intense look and departmental review. They're changing some of the sort of regulations, overseeing things like the takeaway doses and things like that. So I expect some really good things to come out of that, and they're going to come out of the administrative side of things and not have to have the legislature pass laws to do it, which in most cases is the better resolution.
And I know when it comes to issues like synthetic drugs, that can be a moving ball a lot. Sometimes it's better to have the people that are the experts deal with that.
I mean, on that note, I think we have a much more concrete issue with the methadone that is tangible, where positive things can happen. The synthetic drug issue here in town continues to be a moving ball because of the nature of the chemical sequences and the ability for in this case, an individual who's willing to spend millions of dollars to fight every step of the way, he has civil rights too, and he's exercising them to the full extent of the law.
All right, we've got another call from a viewer. Actually, this call came in last week, and I saved it because I was waiting for you to be here, Senator Reinert. It
must be a good one.
Don from Superior was wondering about what the reciprocity bill concerning Wisconsin residents working in Minnesota and vice versa, receiving tax returns from both states, not just one.
Right.
Is that going to be put back on the table anytime soon?
Well, we've kind of made our best offer to Wisconsin at this point, and I think I know which individual that is, and we've had an ongoing conversation about it. It remains a top issue for border workers, whether they're Minnesotans working in Wisconsin or Wisconsinites working in Minnesota. We have roughly 70,000 of those along the border, and per capita, the Twin Ports has one of the biggest populations. In terms of sheer numbers, it's around the metropolitan area. One of the things that was finished in March was a new reciprocity study. Who was working where, how much money were they making, what taxes were they paying. And kind of a fundamental underlying issue is that Minnesota has what we would call a higher billboard rate in terms of income tax, but what people actually pay is lower than Wisconsin because of the 300 deductions that we talked about earlier. So we have a difference between the two states. Now that we have the new study, we know exactly what that difference is. Prior to that, the study was about 30 years out of date. So I know about a month ago, shortly after the study came out, so late March, Commissioner Franz in Minnesota sent Wisconsin a new letter, a new offer on the table. I'm not sure it's one that Wisconsin finds all that appealing because it has a financial implication for them. But the commissioner and I have a breakfast, I think, Thursday of this week where we're going to review exactly where it's at. I'm optimistic, but not hopeful, if that makes sense. Neither state is flush with cash right now, and that's just part of the problem.
And give us a little background on why this happened, why the reciprocity went away.
Sure. One of the big things, and this was when Governor Pawlenty was still in office, and we had, $5-6 billion budget deficits. What was happening was that because there are more Wisconsinites working in Minnesota, Wisconsin always owed Minnesota money. And it was typically coming a year later out of a budget cycle, and so it left a hole in the current budget year. And while it eventually got paid, and it actually got paid with interest, it didn't help the current budget cycle. So Governor Pawlenty canceled the reciprocity agreement. He had the ability at the time to do that, which, just as a side note for interested viewers, a governor in Minnesota no longer has the ability to arbitrarily do that. It must be ratified by the legislature. That was changed subsequently. But Governor Pawlenty did end the reciprocity agreement. It's sort of a basic issue of trying to make things easy for these cross-border workers and to not have this arbitrary line on a map become a really difficult thing. And we know that in the Twin Ports. We want people and commerce to move freely between Duluth and Superior, northeastern Minnesota, and northwestern Wisconsin. So, while, like I said, I'm hopeful but not optimistic, I do really want to continue to work to try and bring this back because I think it only helps our regional economy.
We have a call from Sue in Hibbing, and Sue is wondering, Representative Murphy, is Minnesota one of the states that allows felons to buy firearms? I didn't know any states allowed felons to buy firearms, but maybe there are some. Do you know the answer to that question?
I don't think so, unless all their rights have been restored. But if they're still felons, no.
I believe that's accurate.
All right, and we only have about 2 minutes left, but I did want to address the Purple Caucus, and
sure.
That's something that you've started this session. It's been something you've been working on for a while. Tell people what the Purple Caucus is.
So the Purple Caucus is an idea that actually came out of my military service. When we combine different military branches into one unit, Navy blue, Army green, we call it a purple unit. And so when I first came into the Senate, I tried to identify a couple Republicans who would maybe just form what we were calling a Purple Caucus and sort of have this idea that we'll be Minnesotans first and other political labels second. Not we're going to give up convictions, not that we're going to find agreement on everything, but just that we were willing to sit together and talk and start with where we agree and build out instead of starting where we disagree and trying to build in. And we had our second breakfast this past Wednesday. We had 14 members of the Senate attending. We had another 6 that either had attended the first one or just couldn't make the breakfast time. So that brings us up to about a third of the Senate. And it's been really exciting. They're primarily members that were elected in 10 or 12, and they're also primarily members that come out of a city council, school board, or county commission background where you had that same dynamic. And that was my experience on the council. I certainly knew we had some people to the left of the spectrum and some to the right of the spectrum, but on any given vote, you had a different alignment of folks, and it really emphasized the relationship over any particular unit politics. And where is it going to go? We're not sure. We're just emphasizing right now and trying to build the capacity and seeing if there isn't an opportunity with that group to try and find some more center solutions.
And just in about 10 seconds, are you seeing a fairly equal amount of between
Absolutely.
Republicans and Democrats?
Yeah, without any intention, it's turning out to be almost 50-50.
All right, well, thank you. We are out of time, but we'll address that some more later in the session. We have some more shows coming up. Also, just one more time, if you're wondering who your representative is, call the House Public Information Services at 800-657-3550. Now, that's all the time we have this week for Minnesota Legislative Report. Be sure to tune in next Sunday at 5 p.m. for an update on the week's legislative session. And thanks to the lawmakers, Representative Murphy, Senator Reinert, who took time out of their busy schedules to fill us in on what's happening at the state capitol. I'd also like to thank the volunteers who answer the phones and get your questions on the air. For the crew here at WDSE, WRPT Public TV, I'm Greg Grell. Have a great evening.